David Brewster here with an episode of Chordplay, and this is the Chords of Montrose, and we're going to be talking about the late, great Ronnie Montrose. And Ronnie passed away in 2012, but was definitely a very influential guitarist in the 70s and 80s and beyond, and worked with a lot of important people. Edgar Winter, Van Morrison, Boz Scaggs, of course famously worked with Sammy Hagar on the first Montrose album. And that first Montrose album from '73, massively influential. It's considered, America's answer to Led Zeppelin, even though really that first Montrose album was the special one, and the other albums that followed were good, but nowhere near as good as that first album, and honestly nowhere near as good as Led Zeppelin, in my opinion. I love Zeppelin, but I also really dig Ronnie Montrose. A lot of energy and this kind of ferocious, rhythm style, great leads, great licks and fills and riffs and all kinds of cool stuff. And Ronnie definitely, worked with a lot of different people. Before he really kind of took off on his own, he started the group Gamma, which, was kind of almost like a prog-rock kind of project. But before that, back when he worked with Edgar Winter and Van Morrison, there's Tony Williams, there's a whole bunch of people that he worked with in his career. So here's an image with just some of the people that Ronnie Montrose, kind of worked with or collaborated, recorded, or performed with. And while there is a lot to discuss, surrounding Ronnie Montrose, there is kind of a moment in the 90s that some of you, watching this maybe don't realize, or maybe you don't remember it. But in 1996, there was a video game called Mr. Bones, and Ronnie Montrose actually, recorded and worked on all the guitar and the music for that video game. It was on Sega Saturn, and I actually had a Sega Saturn back in the 90s, and I remember that game. I bought it because it featured the guitar. And keep in mind, this is before Guitar Hero and Rock Band and some of those games, so this was early, like mid-90s, mid to late 90s. But I do remember the music in the game was really cool. There were like a few, chapters or segments where you had to play slide guitar, and you were kind of manipulating, the skeleton or Mr. Bones' hands, on a guitar with the controller. And there was like, kind of these rhythmic-based, puzzles and things. You had to hit buttons, at a certain time, like on a certain beat. There was a scene where you had to play a guitar solo, and there was, a lot of guitar activity in a video game. And I thought that game, even though it was a little buggy, but I thought the music was great, and I loved the fact that it revolved around the guitar and like blues music, and really cool, kind of forgotten game, but Ronnie Montrose totally worked on the soundtrack. The opening, that was Rock the Nation from the Montrose album, and it was something like this. So if you've been watching my channel, you'll definitely know I've mentioned this in several episodes, but I love when guitarists incorporate vibrato with chords, and you hear that movement and that kind of shaky, wavy sound, and that's totally what Ronnie's doing right there in the intro, these partial chords. If you played that without the vibrato, it would sound kind of boring. It doesn't have the same effect. It creates this sense of motion or moving forward, like it's heading somewhere. And it also just creates this kind of unsettled, movement in the chord. So there's like a partial A to partial C to partial D, and then you move that up a whole step, and there's partial B to partial D to partial E. And as far as the vibrato, I'm just kind of shaking, that double stop back and forth, kind of moving toward the floor. And then between the chords, you can kind of hear him hit like the open D and open G just as a transition chord. Something like that. And then you just start kind of, mushing those together a little bit closer. And then you basically basically start playing with this E power chord, and you're kind of moving from E5 to D over E. Something like that. Okay, next up is Bat Motor Scooter from the Montrose album, and this would be the verse section from that song. Very popular song from that album too. That's this part. Basically playing with the C sus2 right here. And Ronnie just kind of lets that chord ring, and then you're moving up to this kind of boogie blues, you know, D5, D6 to D7 right there. And he's kind of bouncing through that, you know, kind of old time rock and roll style. And then go back to that C sus2 and just let it ring. The next two examples feature Ronnie using his thumb, you know, for bass notes in the middle of these riffs. And most people think of Hendrix when they think of, you know, fretting with their thumb. And definitely I'm a huge Hendrix fan, you know, and I've learned a lot of his ideas. But it is kind of cool to seek out other people that use, you know, that idea and kind of see what they do with it. So with Ronnie, this is from One Thing on My Mind from the Montrose album, and it's this. So right there, you're basically starting with the open D and open G. And then you're going to basically, you know, bar this third fret on the D and the G and hammer on from that B flat to B natural. So you're going from the minor third to major third. And once again, a little bit of vibrato right there. And then you're moving up to this, and that's going to function as G7. And then you're going to grab this, you know, double 5 on the G and the B. It's kind of like a G6 sus4, kind of. And then you're going to make your way back down to that double stop with the hammer on between the minor and major third. And then this is where the thumb comes in. So you're going to grab that G note there with your thumb on the 3rd fret low E, and then pull off the F to D on the D string. And then go back to that G one more time. So he kind of saves the thumb for the, you know, very end of that riff, but it does kind of, you know, sneak in there. Next up is Good Rockin' Tonight, also from the Montrose album, and once again he's using his thumb in a very clever way here. It's something like this. Right there you can see we're starting with this, and that's basically, well, we're actually starting with that single B note that your thumb's grabbing. It almost sounds like the opening to that Strokes tune, you know, from what, about 10, 15 years ago. And then you're literally playing A over B right there. And then you're going to move that triad up to B, so now it's just B major. Back to that A over B, and then it's an E over B to B major. the song Razor King, and this is from the Gamma One album, kind of his side project. Because Ronnie definitely released, albums under the Montrose name, under Ronnie Montrose, and then also the Gamma kind of series of albums, and a lot of other albums too. But Razor King's interesting because he's using the slapback delay effect, and he's kind of picking through. And it's a pretty easy guitar part, but I like the fact that he used delay and kind of added it to part of the riff, which really makes it kind of stand out. Something like this, kind of proggy too, really cool. Pretty simple, and he's really just bouncing between two power chords, a B power chord and a D. He's also moving from F sharp to E right there, so he's grabbing the fourth on that first chord. And what you want to do, you can probably hear the delay right there, but you want to palm mute so those notes don't ring very long, because you want to make sure the note is kind of silent, or at least, dampened when the repeat happens. And it creates this kind of looping, bouncy delay effect. So you want to set your delay where the repeat happens, right in between, picking those two parts. And he basically moves that B up to a D. He's really just kind of picking between those two notes on the B. And then do the same thing up there with D. And then go right back to B. Okay, the last example is the very famous Rock Candy, arguably the most famous, Montrose song from that first album. And there's nothing wrong with Paper Money, which was the second album that followed it. Also had Sammy Hagar on it. But it didn't sound the same. It didn't feel the same. The songs are much stronger on that first album, in my opinion. But, it's a very famous song. And this is the chorus part. And there's some interesting little chord shifts. And it's this. That part. So the chorus, starts with that A, and then it's a D over A, but it's that D over F sharp kind of shape, but the A string's still open there. So right there, you're going from that A to the D over A, and then you're going to basically move to this, which is really cool. So there's the open A, the D sharp there on the fourth fret on the D string, the open G, and that D note there on the B string on the third fret. So if we relate that to A, that would be what, an A6 sus4, and then you're literally just moving up to this, and that's going to be a little piece of A7 right there. So really, I like that kind of, sneaking those chords in after this. And you're going to shift those chords. You're going to go up to that A7. And then back to that, A6 sus4. And then he's really just banging the low E string with unison bends. intro riff. Alright, that's going to wrap this episode with the Chords of Montrose, and definitely Ronnie, legendary guitarist, very influential. I think a lot of people, they remember him and they think about, the Montrose album with Sammy Hagar, and definitely there's that connection with Sammy, which, of course, he went on, become a solo artist and eventually played with Van Halen, as a vocalist. But there's something about Ronnie's music, definitely I spent some time going back and, kind of revisiting and listening to some of his albums in preparation for this. And of course, I was just floored all over again with that first, Montrose album, where it's like, man, I don't know if I'm going to be able to move, beyond that first album. You can probably tell on my channel, I definitely support underdogs and the misunderstood or overlooked or almost forgotten, players. And Ronnie fits into that group, players that are important, they're legendary, very influential. But then as time has passed, people have kind of forgotten, like, oh yeah, back in the early 70s, this guy lit rock guitar on fire, But then now in 2020, almost 2021, some people don't know that, they're not aware of it, or they've forgotten it, or they just didn't remember. It's like, oh yeah, that was very special, the way that he did this or that, and it influenced millions. So anyway, leave some feedback and some comments. Please subscribe to Late Night Lessons, and I'll be back before you know it with more content material. Thank you.